everybody! This video is on the topic of solving unwanted behavior without the use of physical or psychological intimidation. So when using positive reinforcement to solve behavior problems, the focus is on training a new behavior to take place of the unwanted behavior, and you're going to train it to the point where it's stronger than the old behavior. And while you're training this new behavior, you can use management and prevention from preventing the old behavior from happening. And if the old behavior were to happen, you can use a technique called interruption, where you're interrupting that behavior and not letting it become rehearsed and practiced again. And there are different ways to do that using positive reinforcement, but very basically you can train a cue like the recall, come, or something like that, and then you can use that to interrupt the behavior. Now you'll need to train and proof this cue so that you'll be able to use it when you need to interrupt unwanted behavior. And I have a video on how to train those cues and also the different cues you can use, and I have a list of 10. I like to think of behaviors in two categories. One is behaviors that are unwanted, that the dogs do, but they're calm and relaxed while doing them. So for example, sitting on your couch. Your dog has a habit of sitting on your couch, and all you need to do is train the dog to do an alternate behavior, which is laying in their dog bed. So that's pretty simple. You just build that behavior to be stronger than the behavior of sitting on the couch. Then the other category of behaviors is that the dog has a high level of arousal doing the behavior, or they have a certain emotion that's connected to the behavior. So for example, that the dog is chasing a squirrel, they're very excited. So when you have a behavior that's unwanted and the dog is also very aroused and very stressed, you can't just use treats, bring out treats, or even punishment trainers. They wouldn't be able to just use punishment in those situations because the animal is too excited to be able to learn correctly, and the reinforcers or punishers aren't going to be effective because they haven't been conditioned to be able to be used in those circumstances. So in those type of situations, what's really necessary is to not put the dog into that exact situation again until the training is complete, but instead to break the training up into small, successful approximations. For example, with a dog that chases cars, you wouldn't initiate the training with the dog on the sidewalk next to the road. You could instead go somewhere like the middle of a park or the edge of a parking lot where the cars are at a distance from the dog to begin with. Another example is that if you had a dog that had an extremely fearful or aggressive reaction to having his nails trimmed, you can't just pick his foot up, trim a nail, and then feed a treat, because for some dogs that's too much and they won't find the food that you give positively reinforcing, and it's not going to change their emotional response to the thing that happened before they got the treat. The thing that happened before they got the treat was so traumatic to the dog that getting a piece of food afterwards isn't going to change their behavior or change their emotional response to having their nails trimmed. So you really need to break the steps up smaller, and one thing you could do specifically with that exercise is teaching the dog to do a recall to the nail clippers or the sound of the Dremel, teaching the dog to put their paw in your hand for reinforcement. These are breaking the steps up so the dog is having a positive emotional response to the equipment and to what's going to happen to their foot, which is putting it in your hand and being held, and then also breaking up the steps of actually trimming the nail. So you're not going to go in and cut a piece off the nail. You're going to move the nail clipper towards the dog, or teach the dog to follow the nail clipper or Dremel first before then going in and cutting a piece off the nail. And in between the training sessions, you could trim the dog's nails using a sand board, so the dog's learning to sand his own nails. But basically, if you go too far too quickly, you'll never progress to the dog, to changing the dog's emotional response. And a lot of people have this problem because nails need to be trimmed regularly, and a lot of people find that there's not enough time in between the trimming to do the training in which they're going to actually change the dog's behavior and emotional response during the trimming. So teaching your dog to file his own nails between training could be a game changer, as well as doing short, tiny sessions where you're just clipping a tiny piece of a nail off in different sessions rather than trying to clip all the nails at the same time in the same session. When training a new desired behavior and emotional response that you want to replace the undesirable old behavior and emotional response, you have to understand that it takes time to condition a new behavior. Basically, you're creating a neural pathway and you're building it every time you do the conditioning with positive reinforcement. And it's also important to understand that sometimes when you think you're training, you're actually not doing effective training. So even though you're repeating something, it's not reinforcing for the dog. For example, the nail trimming scenario, that the steps aren't broken up small enough. So it's important to understand that you need to break the steps up small enough so the dog is having a positive emotional response to the training and learning the new behavior is reinforcing to do. And two, that you're repeating the behavior enough and repeating the behavior where the dog is receiving reinforcement enough that the conditioning is going to be effective. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of people think just a couple training sessions is going to do it, and then they're disappointed when the behavior falls apart. It's the way you can condition behaviors in the brain for the animal to want to do them is very similar to conditioning the body and the muscles. So for example, if you did, 60 sit-ups today, that is not going to make you fit. It's going to take at least 2 weeks of training in a specific way to start to see results. And I love to tell clients that. I tell them, if you have a problem and you're disappointed in your dog, spend the next 2 weeks working on that problem for a couple of minutes a day. So 12 training sessions. Every day, just spend 1 or 2 minutes doing a training session on that behavior, and then after 2 weeks, come back to me and tell me what you found. And usually what happens, if the client has actually, in fact, worked on the problem in 12 training sessions, they will see amazing results. Training and behavior modification is also similar to fitness training in that if you overtrain, it can be detrimental to your training or your fitness, and if you undertrain, you're not going to see progress. So it's hard to find that perfect balance for fitness training, but also for behavior modification and training of behaviors. I have a video tutorial on the topic of how long to train, and I'll link that in the description below. I hope you found this video helpful for your training. If you'd like to support my work, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. You can also become a supporting member of channel Kikopup by clicking the join button. See you later, guys.